Hi guys, welcome to another episode of MrLopezClasses.com. Today is a special episode dedicated to the analysis of the oil sample for diesel and gasoline engines. What is the procedure? The recommendation is minimum once per year take a sample of the oil and send the sample to the laboratory in order to analyze the content of metals, contaminants, additives on the sample. What is the procedure? In a plastic container, like the container that you have on the screen right now, you collect the sample of oil and you put a label on the plastic container, and in the label you mark the serial number of the engine, the model of the engine, the oil used on that oil, the miles or hours on the oil on the engine, and that's the information that you need. Alright, with that information and the sample of oil, you send to the laboratory in each city, in the city where you are located, 100% sure that there are laboratories. Normally Caterpillar have your own laboratories, but those laboratories have a public service. Cummins also, Detroit Diesel also. 100% sure that in your city you have dealers of Caterpillar, Cummins. In those dealers they have laboratory to analyze the oil. Not only the oil, the coolant and the transmission oil. All of them. Alright. As soon as you receive the report, it's a similar report to the report that you have on the screen. You have the report. It's a report similar that the analysis that we are going to do right now, and you need it check metal by metal and identify where is the problem internally in my engine. This is, in my opinion, the doctoral degree of a mechanical gasoline mechanic or diesel mechanic. If you are able to analyze the oil report, the coolant report, and if you are able to solve it and analyze the OBD2 codes by yourself, you are a doctor in gas or diesel engines. This table is available in my webpage. This is the table. You found another table similar to this one for coolant, and other table similar to this one for the codes. This table is adhesive. You remove the paper and you can post it in your minivan, in your shop, this table. It's wonderful because you have all the metal, the cause, the symptom, the solution, metal by metal, organized in a wonderful table. This is a good tool for a mechanic in your shop, in your office, in your minivan. Okay, my friend, I hope that you visit my webpage, my Instagram, my Facebook, and you can buy those posters over there. Those posters and other wonderful posters that I have in those shops. Okay, we are going to start with the analysis, and we are going to start with the first metal. We are going to analyze metal by metal slowly, and we are going to try to think where is located that metal inside of the engine. Alright, the first metal is chromium. Chromium. Normally the concentration of chromium is in between 10 and 30 parts per million. Once again, depending on the laboratory have your own procedures. And normally when you receive the report, the laboratory explain how should be analyzed each report. In some cases, some laboratories, they don't use parts per million. They use points of concentration or something like this. You need check in the bottom of the report the procedure to analyze that report. This is the generic way to analyze any type of report. Alright, we are going to continue with chromium. Chromium. Where you found the chromium? Yes, on the piston rings. Yes, the piston rings have a high content of chromium. What is the symptom? If you have problem with the piston rings, If you have problem with the piston rings, oil blow by, and you have low compression, yeah, that's the first symptom, low compression, and you have a little amount of oil entering in the combustion chamber, not too much, but. And what is the solution? The solution to verify if I have problem on the rings is the compression test. Remember, with the compression test, you can analyze if the problem is on the rings, or if the problem is on the valves, or if the problem is in the head gasket. Check that video in both of my classes, in gas and diesel. I repeat that procedure. Is too simple. With the compression test, you crank the engine 4 or 5 times, and the needle on the pressure gauge advance. If you have in the engine only one cylinder with a low compression below the limit recommended by the manufacturer, you can verify if the problem is rings or valves in this way. You added a little amount of oil through the hole where the spark plug is located, or through the hole where the injector is bolted. You added a little amount of motor oil, fresh motor oil, a little, and you put it back the compression test, the gauge, and you crank the engine again. If the compression increase, similar to the other cylinders in good condition, it's because the problem is on the rings. If you crank again and the compression not increase, continue down, 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 is because you have problems on the valves. If you have two adjacent cylinders with low compression, this is an indication that the problem is on the head gasket. If you have low compression in all the cylinders below the limit, this is an indication that the engine is out. This is only to refresh. If you want more details, visit my videos in both classes, gas and diesel. Alright, that's the solution. You have chromium also in the cylinder liners, and the symptoms are similar. Loss of power, loss of compression, and what is the solution? Compression test. Compression test, and also analyze the coolant. Yes, because remember, in some diesel engines, the cylinder liners are wet cylinder liners. They are surrounded by coolant around. Okay, if the liner is cracked or is perforated for pitting corrosion, it's because the coolant entering in the combustion chamber. Okay, if you analyze the coolant, you found the same amount of chromium, high level of chromium. Other possibility is on the head valves. Where head valves? Yes. What is the symptom? Oil consumption. Remember, if you have too much play in between the valve and the valve guide, the oil penetrate and enter in the combustion chamber. That's the typical symptom, and you have blue smoke. Blue smoke. And what is the solution? Work on the head. Remove the head and send the head to the machine shop in order to replace the valves, the guides, the seals. Those are important seals in order to avoid that the oil enter in the combustion chamber. Other possibility for chromium is wear on the crankshaft or on the camshaft. Wear on the crank or wear on the camshaft. Both of them. And what is the symptom? Loss of power. And also probably you have a knocking because you have too much play in between the bearings and the crankshaft, or in between the bearings and the camshaft. And the solution is rebuild the engine. If you have problem on the crankshaft or on the camshaft, you need to rebuild the engine. This is for chromium. And now we are going to analyze lead. PB, lead. Okay, and normally the concentration is in between 40 and 100 parts per million. Once again, depend of the laboratory. Alright, and where you found that lead? Yes, on the plain bearings. On the plain bearings, it's very common that you found the lead. And what is the symptom? Low oil pressure and knocking. Yes, my friend, remember, the bearings in contact with the crankshaft and the bearings in contact with the camshaft are the elements that keep the pressure recommended for the manufacturer. If the babbitt, if the soft metal is gone on those bearings, you have too much play, the oil pressure decrease, and you have knocking, and you have that consequence. And what is the solution? Rebuild the engine. If you need to replace the bearing, you need to rebuild the engine. Okay, you found that in different bushings, you found that a lot of lead. Once again, it's the same consequence and the same solution. This is for lead. And now we are going to analyze the most important metal, iron. Iron. How much should be the concentration? Normally in between 100 and 200 parts per million. Right? What happens if the concentration is over 200? The situation is dramatic and you need to stop the engine and check the engine immediately. Yeah? Over that number, the situation is dramatic. In the range is acceptable, but in the high part of the range, you need pay attention. You need verify where is located the problem and try to take a solution. All right. For iron, there are a lot of parts with iron in contact with the oil. In contact with the oil. This is the most important part. Okay, the cylinder liners, of course. And once again, you have a lot of problems with the performance of the engine. Low compression, high fuel consumption, loss of power, a lot of problems. And the solution is rebuild the engine. Yes. On the piston rings also. And once again, exactly the same, oil consumption, loss of compression, and rebuild the engine. And the crankshaft and the camshaft, okay, once again, exactly the same, low oil pressure, knocking, and rebuild the engine. Or you have a corrosion in the system. Corrosion in the system, that's not good. If you have corrosion in the system, it's because the oil is emulsified with water. Remember, there are two possibilities for oil emulsified with water. You have one possibility, oil emulsified with coolant, and oil emulsified with salt water. The second one is catastrophic. If you have a corrosion, it's because 100% you have noise on the engine. Because probably if the oil is mixed with the water, immediately the babbitt, the soft metal on the bearings disappear and you have play. If you have play on the crankshaft and camshaft, you have a lot of noise. And of course, you need to analyze also the coolant, because probably in the coolant sample you found oil or vice versa. You need to analyze both of them. And okay, you found a lot of iron in the head valves and the train of the rocker arms. Those elements have a lot of content of iron. Okay, and what is the consequence? Overheating, loss of power, noise, knocking. Yeah, normally you have a knock sensor activated on the head because you have too much play on the rocker arms and the valves. And what is the procedure is repair the head. Repair the head, remove and replace the head valves, the train, the rocker arms, probably the push rods, because probably the push rods are working properly. Okay, problem on the gears. You remember how many gears you have? You have one gear for the crankshaft, other gear for the camshaft, other gear for the raw water pump, other gear for the fuel injection pump, if diesel. A lot of gears, those gears work together. If the lubrication in the timing cover is not appropriated, those gears are working dry and the metal the gears are in contact metal with metal and the metal is eroded. Alright, and what is the consequence? Stuck or broken parts and a lot of noise. Of course, you have a knocking sensor activated if you have a high level of iron. And what is the solution? Rebuild the engine. If you have a lot of iron in any of those parts, it's because you have lubrication problems. You need to verify your oil pressure, and you need to verify the condition of the oil. Alright, this is for iron, and now we are going to continue with other important element. It's the aluminum. The aluminum. And we are going to check where we found that aluminum. Aluminum is on the pistons. And that's the most important part, on the pistons. And what is the consequence? Of course, loss of power, loss of compression. And what is the solution? Rebuild the engine. Yeah, if you have problem on the pistons, rebuild the engine. different aluminum castings. The case of the coolant pump, the case of, in some cases, brackets, a lot of cases internally in the engines are fabricated in aluminum. Okay, you need to analyze where is the problem and try to identify where is the wear. Okay, what happens if the problem is on the piston? Probably you have detonations, you have a loss of power, you have a low compression, you have a knocking, and you can verify if the problem is on the piston with the compression test, with the cylinder leak test, this is the previous episode, and also you can verify with the camera, with the boroscope. You introduce the camera and you verify the condition of the head of the pistons and the condition of the liner, and you can take a decision if you need to remove the head or not. But normally when you remove the head, you clarify the majority of those types of problems. Okay, other possibility, the symptoms when you have a problem on aluminum castings is leaks and noise, a lot of noise. For that reason, the stethoscope is important in order to focus where is located the noise specifically. And the solution is remove and replace the part. For example, if you have problem on the coolant pump, because the bearings of the coolant pump are damaged, this is other element that normally is fabricated in cast aluminum. Yes, you need to replace the coolant pump. It's easy to identify if the noise is in the coolant pump because normally the coolant pump is external, and with the stethoscope you can verify if the bearings are damaged or if the shaft is broken because you have a leak over there. Alright, on the plane and truss bearings, yeah, in those bearings there are a lot of aluminum. And how you know if you have a problem on the truss bearings? Normally, if you move the harmonic balancer a little, you can verify that you have a little play. Normally, you don't have play on the crankshaft, but if you can move it, the crankshaft back and forward, it's because the truss bearings are damaged. Why the truss bearing can be damaged? This is a problem on the transmission, probably this is a problem on the propeller. Probably you have a propeller with too much pitch for that boat. This is not the pitch recommended for the manufacturer. In other words, your boat is overload. Your boat is overload. Remember, overload or underload. And how can you fix it? Is on the pitch. You can verify that situation on my Introduction to Marine Engineering book. Alright, my friends, and if you have problem on the truss bearings, once again, it's a low oil pressure. If you have problem on the plane bearings, doesn't matter if are the radial bearings or the axial bearings, you have low oil pressure immediately. Remember, at the beginning of this course, I explained to you that you need to check continuously two gauges, the oil pressure gauge and the coolant temperature gauge. Those gauges are important. If the temperature in the coolant temperature gauge pass the limit, you need to stop the engine immediately. If the oil pressure on the gauge goes down below the limit, you need to stop the engine. Normally the engine stops by itself because you remember the switches interrupt the current in the run relay and the engine stops suddenly. You remember that? Check that video. It's the chapter 14, episode number 5 or 6, dedicated to the how to do the harness for an engine, gas or diesel. That's a wonderful episode. Alright, my friends. Aluminum. Other possibility for aluminum is housings of the pump, like I explained before. The coolant pump is an example. You have leaks, and of course, if you have problem on the coolant pump or circulating pump or freshwater pump, you have high temperature problems. And what is the solution? Remove and replace those parts. Aluminum on the head. There are a lot of engines with the head in aluminum. Yeah, if the head is affected because small pieces of metal enter in the combustion chamber, and those pieces of metal destroy the head, like that picture. This is an example, a typical example when somebody introduced a penny or a screw in the turbo, in the cold side of the turbo. That piece of metal is destroy the blades of the turbo, enter in the combustion chamber, and destroy the head. That's dramatic. You need to replace the head. Okay, in that case, you have a milky oil on the coolant, and you need to remove and replace the head. Alright? And now we are going to continue with copper. Other important element is copper. Copper, the concentration normally should be in between 10 and 50 parts per million. Where we found that copper? Okay, on the bearings on the turbo. You remember those bearings, and the bearings on the small rod, on the connecting rods. That small rod is also in copper. It's a bronze alloy. Yes, in general is in plain bearings. And what is the consequence? Immediately, if you have problems on the turbo, you have black smoke, you have noise, and of course, in some cases, low oil pressure. And what is the solution? Rebuild the turbocharger in that specific case. On the oil cooler, remember that in this moment we are analyzing metals in contact with the oil. Okay, the oil passed through the oil cooler, and the oil cooler is fabricated in a special famous alloy. You remember that alloy? Is the copper nickel 9010. The copper nickel alloy is famous for oil coolers. This is an alloy with a low corrosivity. For that reason, it's used in marine environments. Okay, the oil cooler is affected. You have milky oil mixed with salt water. That's different than when the oil is milky, because it's mixed with it's emulsified with coolant. It's different. In that case, because it's emulsified with salt water, the odor is not good. The odor of the oil is not good, and additionally, the color is brown. It's specific when the oil is mixed with salt water, and this is not good because the engine is damaged internally. The salt water destroyed everything. Okay, what is the solution? Replace the oil cooler as soon as possible. Flush the oil on the engine 2 times, and run the engine with fresh oil, and verify if after 1 hour of operation, if you don't have nothing milky oil. If the oil continue milky after 1 hour of operation, probably you damage internally in the engine's other elements. Okay, my friends, on the clutch plates in the transmission, you found a lot of copper. This is a particular case, and if you have a problem on the clutch plates on the transmission, what is the symptom in the engine? The overspeed, because the engine accelerates too much to engage the transmission. You have overspeed on the engine. This is normally the symptom. And what is the solution? Rebuild the transmission. Okay, bronze bushing. A lot of bronze bushings. I explained to you in the small rod of the connecting rod is in bronze. On the turbo, on the supercharger, the bearings and each end of the roots are in a special copper alloy. This is other example. Remember that those bushings are lubricated with motor oil. And what is the solution? Turbo performance, low performance, and rebuild the turbocharger. Also, it's possible in the head gasket. Remember, I explained to you in previous episodes that there are a lot of diesel engines with a copper head gasket, especially diesel engines supercharged, or diesel engines for race cars, race boats. Those engines use copper head gasket. If the copper head gasket is affected for some reason, the copper is mixed with the oil, and you found a high concentration of copper, probably from the head gasket. And of course, if you have problem with the head gasket, you have a low compression, you have high temperature, you have poor engine performance. And the solution is, once again, check the compression test. With the compression test, you can identify if the problem is on the rings, if the problem is on the gasket or if the problem is on the valves. Okay, this is for copper, and we are going to continue with tin. For my friends in Spanish, this is antimonio. Antimonio in Spanish is tin. Alright, my friend. Tin, the concentration is in between 10 and 30 parts per million. 10 and 30 parts per million cause plain bearings. You found a lot of tin, a lot of antimonio on the bearings. And what is the symptom? Of course, if you have problem on the bearings, it's low oil pressure and you have high temperature and you need rebuild the engine. There's no other solution. And also you found the tin in bushings, bronze and brass bushings. You remember the difference between bronze and brass is according with the level of the content of zinc. In bronze, you don't have zinc. For that reason, bronze is a marine copper alloy accepted for ABYC. Brass, no. Alright, in bushings, once again you have an excessive play. Remember what bushing is fabricated in copper. The small rod on the connecting rods is in copper. That copper alloy have high content of tin. For that reason, you have excessive play on the piston pin, and you have 100% sure the knocking code activated. Knocking code that normally is reflected on the head. Alright, and rebuild the engine. Or you found a lot of tin in the oil cooler. Remember, the alloy is copper nickel, but the soldering area have a high content of tin and silver. Alright, you need if you have problem on the oil cooler, 100% that you have a milky oil, and in that particular case the oil is milky with salt water, you need flush the engine, replace the oil cooler as soon as possible. Alright, replace the oil cooler. Okay, or you found a lot of tin on the valve train, normally on the rocker arms, or in the bushings. You remember that the rocker arms are connected in one common rail like this. Those rocker arms. The rocker arms in contact with the pipe have a bronze bushings, and those bushings have high content of tin. Alright, if you have deterioration of those bushings, probably you have a high content of copper, high content of tin, and high content of silver. Alright, my friends, and of course you have excessive oil consumption, and you need replace the valves. Alright, in this particular case we are going to continue with nickel. Nickel, an important element in the fabrication of marine parts. Alright, nickel, inside of the engine, where you found the nickel? On the crankshaft and the camshaft. Yes, my friends, this is a special alloy with a high content of nickel. But if you have problems where crankshaft or camshaft, you have serious problem in your engine. Yes, you have a low engine performance, probably 100% sure that you have a knocking code on the computer. Because you have too much play in between the bearings and the crankshaft. And if the crankshaft or the camshaft is wear, you need to rebuild the engine as soon as possible. Alright, on the valve train, yeah, I explained before, it's exactly the same. You have too much play on the rocker arms, and you have too much play in between the valve and the valve guide. And 100% sure that you have a excessive oil consumption and you have blue smoke. And of course the engine performance is down. Alright, the excessive oil consumption, and you need work on the head. Yes, it's possible repair only the head. Yes, you remove the head and you send the head to the machine shop, and they replace the valves guides, the seals, the seat valves, and the head is completely recovered. Alright, or you have a lot of wear on the gears. Remember, you have a lot of gear for crankshaft, for camshaft, for raw water pump, for fuel injection pump, for coolant pump, depending on the engine. You have more or less gears. If you have those gears, wear gears, probably it's because you found a high content of nickel in the oil sample. What is the symptom? low engine performance, once again knocking, and you need to rebuild the engine. Alright, in the cylinder liners, yes, you found it, high content of nickel in the cylinder liners. And what is the symptom? Of course, low engine performance, and you need a compression test and 100% sure that you need to rebuild the engine. Remember that in the majority of the marine applications, especially in diesel applications, the liners on the cylinders are wet liners, and you can remove and replace 1 or 2 liners inside of the engine room. You don't need to remove the block outside. Okay, other possibility for high content of nickel is on the oil cooler. And what is the symptom? The symptom, if I found that high level of nickel in the oil cooler, is milky oil. Milky oil with salt water. That's no good. The odor is no good. The color is no good. And what is the recommendation? Replace the oil cooler as soon as possible and flush the oil on the engine minimum 2 times. Alright, and other important metal is molybdenum. Molybdenum. Once again, we found that molybdenum in additives. Additives on the oil. Excessive amount of additives. Normally, I don't recommend additives for motor oil. I recommend additives for fuel. But I don't recommend additives for motor oil, and I don't recommend additives for transmissions. Why? Because those additives produce a gel elements, and the gel clogged the cavities, the small cavities where the oil passed, and soon or later you have a big dramatic problem. I don't recommend additives. Excessive amount of additives is not good. And yes, the majority of the additives, they have high content of molybdenum. The concentration of molybdenum should be in between 5 and 10 parts per million. Okay, what is the symptom? You have excessive oil deposits. When you change the oil or when you remove the oil pan, you found that a lot of slag, like a gel, in the oil pan. This is because you use too much additives. You need to avoid use additives. Use the straight oil, like I explained in the episode dedicated to lubricants in my diesel class and gasoline class. Alright, and yes, flush the coolant and flush the oil and flush both of them, coolant and oil. Alright, you found that excessive molybdenum if the crankshaft and the camshaft are wear. Exactly the same like here with the nickel. And the consequences are the same, low engine compression, and you need to rebuild the engine, both of them. If the crankshaft and the camshaft are wear, you need to rebuild the engine. No other possibility. Other possibility for a high content of molybdenum is on the piston rings. On the piston rings, once again, you have low compression, probably the oil penetrates the combustion chamber, and you have a low engine performance. How can you check that? With the compression test. Yeah, you have low engine compression, and you need to verify the compression test or the cylinder leaks and rebuild the engine. Okay, zinc. Where I found that high content of zinc, the zinc should be in between 10 and 20 parts per million. Okay, I have a high content of zinc in oil additives. Once again, in the additives or anti-age additives. What is the consequence? Too much coolant deposits, and if those additives are on the oil, you found too much gel on the oil pan. Flush the coolant and flush the oil, both of them. And on the plain bearings. On the plain bearing also you found the zinc. And what is the symptom? Low oil pressure. If the plain bearings, if the soft metal or babbitt or white metal is gone on the plain bearings, 100% sure you have a low oil pressure, and you have too much play, and you have a knock sensor activated. And rebuild the engine. That's not good. Vanadium. Vanadium normally is concentrated in between 0 and 5 parts per million. Where you found the vanadium? Normally is because the fuel is contaminated. When you use fuel on the Caribbean or some regions with a high level of contaminants, that fuel is no good. And in this particular case, is because the oil is mixed with fuel. This is not normal, but it's possible if, for example, in the priming pump, the diaphragm on the priming pump is damaged. The fuel pass and penetrate and is mixed with the oil. And also it's possible that the oil be mixed with fuel if you have a problem with the rings, and if you have one or two injectors damaged and the injectors are leaking constantly in the combustion chamber, and the oil penetrate, pass through the piston rings and go down for gravity into the oil pan. This is a very, very common possibility. This is a problem with the injectors. And what is the symptom? The symptom in that case is hard start, and immediately the engine starts, you have a big amount of black smoke, and the black smoke disappear. But at the beginning you have excessive black smoke. This is because one or two injectors not close, and when the engine is off, they are leaking constantly. What is the solution? I explained in the class of fuel injectors. Remove the injectors, test the injectors, or send the injector to the laboratory to verify the pressure, to verify the pattern, and to verify the flow. Okay? Yes, you have a lot of black smoke because the fuel is bad, and you need to flush the fuel tank and check fuel injectors and check fuel injection pump if it's necessary. In both cases, in gasoline engines, it's possible that a couple of injectors in the common rail bit, yes, it's common. In both of them, in outboards and inboards, a couple of injectors are damaged, stay open all the time. Remember that if the engine is off, the common rail, the fuel pressure rail, is pressurized, and you introduce fuel in the combustion chamber. When you try to start the engine, probably no start because the cylinders are flooded with gasoline. Okay, other element in high concentration is titanium. Titanium normally is also in between 0 and 5 parts per million. I found it in titanium in the cylinder liners. And once again, you know low engine compression if the cylinders low engine performance, and you need to check the compression test and normally rebuild the engine. This is the consequence. Okay, we are going to continue with other elements, but we are going to start with additives. And after that, we are going to continue with the contaminants. This is the first additive that we found it in the oil sample. Phosphorus. Oil additives, anti-wear. What is the symptom? In general, no affect the performance. No affect the performance, only affect the amount of deposits on the oil pan. And probably if you added too much additives, you clogged the cavities where the oil pass. You need to change the oil, flush the oil with no additives. And also because you have excessive wear on the turbo bearings, and the symptoms is too much lateral play on the turbo. You remember in the chapter dedicated to the turbos, I explained that movement, the lateral play. What is the solution? Rebuild the turbocharger. Send the turbocharger to the machine shop in order to replace those bearings. Those bearings are special bearings, plain bearings with high content of phosphorus. Those bearings should be replaced in a special shop, machine shop, with special tools, because you don't have the tools to replace those bearings. Okay, my friends, sulfur. What about the level of sulfur? If you found that high level of sulfur, there are two possibilities. Once again, in the small rod of the connecting rod, the piston pin, if those piston pins are wear, they have high level of sulfur. Probably you have a NOx sensor activated, and you need basically, you can solve it if you added additives for high viscosity. But I recommend repair. I recommend replace the pistons and the piston pins. And also you found that high level of sulfur if the fuel is bad fuel with a high concentration of sulfur with more than 150 parts per million. You remember this? Depending on the area, depending on the country, there are countries with high concentration of sulfur, and Depending on the concentration of the sulfur is the quality of the fuel and is the quality of the smoke. Okay, but in general, if you have a little amount of sulfur in the oil sample, no affect the performance of the engine. But I recommend change the oil, flush the oil, and replace the fuel and use appropriate fuel. Okay, and bottom. This is the typical concept element on the additives for both of them, for coolant and for oil. Those additives increase the oil pressure. Those additives are highly recommended for people interested to sell the boat, to sell the car as soon as possible, increase the oil pressure for a couple of weeks, and after that the oil pressure decrease again. In general, no affect the performance, but the recommendation is flush the oil. Okay, you found that excessive amount of boron also in the coolant in the coolant additives. Yes, this is when you use excessive amount of additives, SCAs, supplemental coolant additives. I explained those additives in the class of cooling system and also in my table. The table specialized in a coolant sample analysis. All right, what is the too much deposits on the coolant, and you need flush the coolant. All right, and what about sodium? Sodium is a metal. That metal is normally located also in additives, oil additives, and no affect the oil performance. You need flush the oil, and in both of them, in oil additives and coolant additives, and you need flush the coolant and flush the oil. The same with magnesium. Magnesium is another metal of the second group, and is found in both of them. In oil additives and coolant additives. And now we are going to check contaminants. What is the most famous contaminant? Silica. What is silica? Silica is sand. Oh, where I have silica inside of my engine? Normally you don't have silica, but if you have silica, it's because your air filter is clogged. It's because the service on your engine is poor, and you need to replace the air filter frequently because sand is located on the air filter, and suddenly small particles of sand enter in the combustion chamber. If sand enters in the combustion chamber with the air at high pressure, it's like a sandpaper, and you wear the cylinder liners, the face of the piston, and the combustion chamber, and you lose compression, and you lose everything. You lose engine performance. Okay, if you have silica, it's because the air filter is clogged. Black smoke, of course, because remember, if the engine receives less air, the engine compensates with more fuel. It's intelligent. Okay, and the solution is replace the air filter. Or also you found that silica on the seals. There are seals broken, seals damaged. Those seals have high content of silica. No affect the engine performance, but you have leaks. You have leaks of oil. You remember the most famous seals on the engine? The front crankshaft seal and the back crankshaft seal, the rear crankshaft seals. Yeah. Okay. You need to flush the oil and you need to fix those leaks. Calcium is another contaminant. Calcium. Where I found that calcium? In salt water. The oil is milky, and you need to remove and replace the oil cooler. You found that calcium in coolant additives, excessive deposits, and you need to flush the coolant. And chlorine. Chlorine is another contaminant. Where is normally located chlorine? In salt water. What is the composition of salt water? What is the composition of salt? The salt that you use every day is sodium and chlorine. Yeah, and high level of chlorine. And what is the consequence when salt water is mixed with the oil? You remember, milky oil. You need to replace the oil cooler. You need to flush the oil immediately. Yes, it's on the salt water, milky oil, and you need to replace the oil cooler. And other one is potassium. Potassium is other typical contaminant. It's because you are using excessive additives on the coolant. You need you have a lot of deposit and you need to flush the coolant. Those are the most famous metal dispersed on the oil sample, additives and contaminants. And this is the procedure to analyze those samples. And this is the procedure to verify where should be located the problem and how can I solve the problem. If you analyze this video and the video related with the coolant analysis, coolant sample analysis, and the videos related with the codes, and the procedure to solve the codes, those videos should be together. If you are an expert in all of those 3 videos, probably you are a good doctor for gasoline and diesel engines. I hope you enjoy these videos. I hope you enjoy this explanation. And I hope that this information be useful for you in your business, in your career.